Let's start Baseline Tech Talk Tuesday.
Awesome. Welcome,
Beautiful.
everybody. So again, we have Dan Conger, our National Training Manager, Chris Wright, VP of Sales, and myself, Andy Humphrey, RSM in the Northeast. And today we're going to go a little bit deeper into moisture sensors. Last week we spoke about Base Manager and we showed a couple reports that are very helpful, and one of which includes the moisture data and the runtime data. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to jump into moisture information. So we're going to start here. This particular slide, I've labeled the goal, because when using a soil moisture sensor, we'd like to have a sensor that's properly installed in the proper location so we can collect the type of data that is required and useful for looking at graphs like this. So in this example, we have two important pieces of data. One are the blue bars, which represent run times. And the second piece is the green spikes, which represent the moisture. And so if you have a properly installed sensor in the proper location, you can overlap your moisture information with your runtime, and that tells you a lot about how you're watering and what's going on that particular site. So in order to get to this, again, this is the goal. We're going to touch on it again in just a minute. We have to talk about where to install the moisture sensor. So we're going to start right here. This is actually a picture I took, I think it was last summer in my hometown in Traverse City, and wanted to point this out because, or ask the group and ask you, Dan or Chris, would we put a sensor in this location?
I'm going to venture...
Trick question.
No. Yeah, trick question. Because the correct answer, I'm not going to say because this is going to be recorded. So just no.
Right. What about if we put the sensor in those green spots?
Yeah. We got some serious issues going on there. That's all.
Yeah,
it looks like.
that zone needs to solve its distribution uniformity issues before we look at irrigating it properly for conservation purposes.
Right. So as we go through some of these images, we want to mention that, and this comes up quite frequently, that the sensor is a tool that collects data, but the sensor is not a tool that solves your specific site problems. We're going to move on to the next one. What about this zone? Got some green and some brown going on here.
I would say this is just a different flavor of what we just saw. There's some coverage or hydraulic issues that you got to resolve them before we try and do any smart irrigation on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't want to put the sensor in trouble zones, areas that have dry spots, areas that may be on the top of a berm, areas that have puddles. We don't want to put the sensor in those trouble areas, or what happens is that sensor will potentially cause all the other zones to act just like the problem zone. Like in this picture here. This is another, what we might call problem zone. Hopefully all the zones don't look like this, but what might happen if we put the sensor in this zone, or even in a zone that was slightly less wet than this zone, that wasn't puddling but was wet all the time?
Then likely the other zones around it would be dry if they were linked to it.
Right.
They all think that they're plenty wet and there's no reason to irrigate everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be kind of like if you located your thermostat next to the window and the window is open all day and it was the winter, your heat is going to run 24/7 because it thinks that the whole house or the whole system is just like the zone that the sensor's buried in.
Well, so that's how you trick a sensor in an office when you can't get to the thermostat, right? Is you try and open the window or put something near it to influence it. And we don't want to try and trick a sensor.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I think you could probably relate to this, Dan and Chris, is that oftentimes when we start talking about sensors and we have a group of people, the first thing that comes to mind is using the sensor to solve a specific site problem, when really that's not the goal of the sensor. And we'll speak a little bit later to, if you did want to use a sensor in that type of scenario, what you might do for that. Instead, what we want to talk about is where to put the sensor that's the correct location. On this picture, I've located 3 sensors that would all be good locations. We can talk about why. One sensor location that would not be as good, which you can see here X'd out. So let's see, what makes a good sensor location? A couple things that I think about first. The first one is what you might call a good zone. So you want a zone where all the sprinklers operate correctly, the pressure is potentially good, the spacing is correct, you have head-to-head coverage, the things that make a good irrigated zone a good zone. So that's the first thing you want to start with. The second thing would be looking for zones that have good exposure to sun. We can talk about that a little bit later, but not putting a sensor in the total shade unless that is the purpose of the sensor, to control shade zones. And we're going to get to that, I believe, on the next slide. But to look for an area that's flat, that has good coverage, and that has good sun exposure. So this picture pretty much illustrates this. This location here would not be ideal. I don't know if you want to speak to this, Dan, the reasons why.
So, there's a couple of reasons on that edge. The first one is that it's near concrete. Now, that isn't an enormous concrete walkway, but the concrete holds a lot of heat, and that it could dry out faster on the edges. So that's why it wouldn't be a good place. The other reason might be that maybe that's where somebody puts a kid's swimming pool or dumps the mop bucket, right? If that might put extra moisture there on that.
Yeah, that's
edge.
a good point. You know, oftentimes people use the garden hose with those specialty nozzles to clean off their sidewalk. So if that's the case, this sensor is going to get wet, perhaps periodically, without irrigation being applied.
Yeah,
that sensor location also looks like it's at the bottom of a slope of that, the grade of that turf, right? So water could potentially drain down and be wetter there, dammed against that concrete, as opposed to in the middle of the lawn.
Yeah. Yeah, and today we don't have enough time to talk about all the ins and outs on how to install it, how to hook it up, how to wire it, and all of that. We'll have to touch on that later. But I did want to just draw a valve box and remind you that on a retrofit situation, the sensor gets wired to the closest zone valve, and that removes the need to run a home run wire all the way back to the garage. So in this home application, more than likely the controller is either in the inside of the garage, the outside of the garage, maybe in the basement, and there's no need to run a wire all the way back to the controller. Every sensor has a built-in decoder, and we're able to talk from the controller out to the sensor using that existing wire path. And so in the process of locating the ideal zone, if there's 3 that all meet the criteria, then I would choose a zone that has a valve box close by to minimize the labor involved in burying that sensor.
It also acts as a good indicator as to where your sensor may be located, so that you avoid issues such as this, which came out of my yard this weekend because I did not mark where my sensors were buried and hit it with a shovel, created a little shovel blight. So always marking where your sensors are, either with a physical marker or with a marker in Base Manager, so you can see where it is, then that means you can avoid it when you're doing maintenance on the property. Yeah,
absolutely. Good call. And believe it or not, oftentimes in classroom environments, we have people that have this bright idea. Dan, I got an idea. Can I just put it in a valve box? Then I'll know where it is.
Yes, you could, but no, you don't want to.
Because then it won't see any irrigation or rainfall.
Right. Yeah. I love that light bulb when that goes off.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So then let's move into how many sensors do we need? And of course, this is a question that doesn't have a right answer, because you could have a site that has 6 zones, or you could have a site that has 600 zones. So what we wanted to do was to use Base Manager as a visual example that you can see here and talk about how we use one sensor to control multiple zones on a site and kind of the methodology that goes behind creating these groupings of zones. So in this screen capture, what you can see are zones 1 through 5, just happens to be a program 1. It's called the Spring program. And the way that we set up and program sensors inside the controller, this is the primary way to do it. There's alternate methods, but the primary way to do it is to, first of all, make a note to which zone the sensor is buried in. So if you can remember last week when we went through Base Manager, I spoke to naming the sensor with the zone number. And that comes in handy for a couple of reasons. One, it helps when you run those reports to know which sensor and which zone so you can overlap the data. It also helps when you're assigning your zones and your sensors in your program. So we use something that's called a primary and linked relationship that we can see here inside this program. So what you want to do is choose the zone that has the sensor buried in it. And in this example, looks like we've got zone 1 that literally has the sensor buried in that zone. That zone is watering that particular sensor. And when we set it up, we change the zone mode to be called primary. And a primary zone distinguishes that zone has a sensor in it, and we can use that sensor to control a grouping of zones.
So essentially we're creating a microclimate, right? Of a representative zone and then linking like zones of that microclimate to it.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have 5 zones that are all, let's say this doesn't have enough information here for us to know, but let's just assume these are all the same sprinkler type. So let's say these are all spray heads. You would locate the sensor or in zone 1, call it the primary zone, and then all the other zones that are just like the primary zone, you group together and you choose which zone you want it to link to. So here we have zones 3, 4, and 5. They're all linked to the primary. So the primary zone is going to control it based on the moisture sensor that we've assigned. However, we can make micro adjustments. So we know that it is rare that 2 zones are identical, right? Unless they're side by side or it's a nice wide open park and those zones really are identical. And if that's the case, we can link them at 100%. Okay, so in zone 5, we have this linked at 100%, and that means it's going to get 100% of the water that zone 1 receives. And when
whatever the zone 1 runtime is, that's what the runtime will be for 5 if it's 100%.
Correct. So in this case, we have a 10-minute total runtime, but it's been split up into a 5-minute cycle with a 10-minute soak. Okay, so as we look down at zone 5, we see the same thing. 5-minute cycle, 10-minute soak, because it's matched up 100% to the primary. Zone 3, I think in this case we'll have to just disregard the names. This came off of a demo account. We see 120% of the runtime or of the zone linked 3 to 1. So 3, we can make some assumptions that this zone either had more exposure, perhaps it did not have the same distribution uniformity, or perhaps it even had maybe different nozzles and it needs more water. So you can put 120%, and every time zone 1 waters, zone 3 will receive 120%. And we can see that in the runtime. 1 minute is automatically added. And then the same thing here we see on zone 4, it's only getting 80%. So 80%, we could assume that is likely a little bit in the shade, or maybe it's on the bottom of a slope. And so you can make up in your group, you could have 10 zones all being watered by one soil moisture sensor, but every zone can be more or less water than the primary. Oops, so jump back up to that. Hold on. Do we have any questions about this programming methodology? And again, it is a primary and linked arrangement. And one thing I'll also mention, you can set up this arrangement with or without the use of a moisture sensor. So adding this moisture sensor down below is how we decide and choose which sensor, but you can still set up this grouping of primary and linked without a sensor.
Andy, then the kind of a question / summarize on, since the controller can have 200 different zones on a base station 3200, I can't have 200 different soil moisture sensors on there, nor would we want to. So this linked and primary helps us get the number of soil moisture sensors down to a reasonable number, if nothing else.
Yeah, correct. So let's say you had 100 zones. That'd be a very large site. And you were going to put 20 zones on a program. That would give you 5 programs. So you may use 5 sensors to control those 100 zones. Mm-hmm. Or you could have 15, or you could have 4. One way to look at it is 1 sensor per program is kind of a basic way to look at how many sensors you might need.
Okay. All right, let's take a look at some additional graphs.
Awesome. So here's the graph we first looked at, which was kind of the goal. We want to see the movement of water from wet to dry. And again, we're looking at the blue, which represents runtime, 60 minutes and 120 minutes. And we're looking at the green, which represents the moisture data over time. Across the bottom, we can see the days. So this is 1 month, basically the month of July in 2017. And the first thing I see are periods without any irrigation. So we watered on the 6th, and then we didn't water again until the 17th. However, we see movement of water in the soil profile.
So that didn't come from sprinklers. Where'd that come in from?
That's right. So this is 99% likely rain events. And the beauty of this is that we were able to skip days based on rainfall, where typically the little cork discs and the mini clicks and such may dry out and rewater. The controller was kept off. This green bar represents the lower threshold, was kept off for just about 10 days because this rainfall kept filling the tank back up periodically. And it didn't water again until we reached that lower threshold.
So then on the 17th, it watered up, and then that took a couple of days off. So on the 18th and 19th, it didn't water. But the 20th is kind of weird. So I'm seeing on the 17th, when it waters, the green moisture content goes way up.
Yep.
And then it dries down a little bit over a period of time, and then it's ready to water again. But that 20th, it ran for 60 minutes, just like it did on the 17th. But for some reason, it didn't get the soil very wet.
Yeah, and if you look, so I'm seeing the 17th and the 22nd almost are identical with 60 minutes. And then you're right, the 20th, we just had this little bump up in the moisture. And again, without knowing exactly, we can make some assumptions, but I would assume that the conditions changed on that day. So when the sprinklers came on, it could either be extremely windy, it could be really hot, there could be the sprinkler that was actually watering that sensor could have been blocked. For some reason, this 60-minute runtime did not have as much effective watering as it typically does. And I think because it rebounded and the pattern picked back up, it was probably not a problem with the zone, but more than likely something like a high wind day.
Yeah. So whatever it was, there was very little effective irrigation that day.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. So I've got a question that came in regarding the lower threshold line and calibration. How do you calibrate a sensor to determine what a threshold is?
So if you're me, you just look at the data and you know enough and you set the threshold. So let me speak to what we're looking at here so that you can get an idea on what the data is telling us. Okay, so number one, when we talk about a lower threshold setting, we're talking about a dry point, the depletion, okay, the maximum allowable depletion. When we're looking at the data and we see these spikes, whenever we see a spike that looks like a needle point, that is the soil essentially not able to hold the water. So it's draining back out. So this is what you would consider saturation. Okay.
Right.
And so when we see the moisture dry down and become a slower dry down, which we might call the shoulder of the curve, that is the field capacity, or the like perfect wet point. Okay. And so these events here are overwatering, or in this case, over raining. And we want to find field capacity. And then you can use some rule of thumbs, like taking 15 or 20% away from field capacity to set your depletion. Or you can use let our controller do it in the auto calibration cycle. Oftentimes I'll recommend having 30 days of data on the system, just running, based on time, like every other controller, taking a look at this graph, making some assumptions on where field capacity is, and then setting your lower threshold.
Okay.
Let's jump ahead. We've got some more interesting data to look at. This one, there's a couple key things I wanted to point out here. Number one are these staircases. And if we were in a classroom, I would ask all of you, what are these staircases? But since we can't do that, I'm just going to tell you that the staircases represent the day-night interval. So again, in Base Manager, you can hover over this line and it'll tell you the time of day that you're looking at. And where we see it sit flat, that's nighttime, right? So if you think of your soil moisture at night, when there's no evapotranspiration occurring, the soil actually stays very constant with its moisture. And then right about 10 a.m. to noon, when the temperature spikes, the wind picks up, the plants start drinking, if you will, it dries down. So what we're looking at here is day, night, day, night, day, night, and this is the day-night interval. And we're seeing the same thing over here. So this speaks to the sensitivity of the sensors and an environment of proper installation where there's not too much compaction. The sensor is able to pick up those intervals between day and night. So that was the first interesting piece here. Another one is if we look here at the difference between a 20-minute cycle and a 25-minute cycle. On this 25-minute cycle, I see little peaks, which could be saturation. But overall, I'm not seeing really much of a difference in the effective watering application between 20 and 25 minutes. So it's likely 20 minutes with this threshold here was okay in terms of filling it up to field capacity. And so it just speaks to the fact that you can look and see what does 20 minutes do to the moisture? And what is the difference between 20 or 25 minutes?
So it almost looks like they added another 5 minutes runtime and they didn't need to.
Yeah, perhaps. If anything, again, we can only make assumptions. I would have let it dry down more and then increase the runtime so we have more days in between waterings. But it does look like if they had stuck to 20 minutes, it could have been an every other day type of situation. Let's jump to the next. Oh, this one's good. Forgot about this one. So what we're looking at here, again, is the difference between 20 minutes and 40 minutes. Are we seeing really any difference in the watering or the effective moisture that's reaching the sensor?
Moisture content isn't changing even with doubling the runtime.
Not much at all. That's right. So essentially 20 minutes was watering it up to field capacity or even maybe a little into saturation, that adding another 20 minutes is really just not effective.
I think one of the things I like about this graph and about soil moisture sensors is it's a great window into what's going on in the soil, right? Because when I started doing irrigation, someone told me it was 10 minutes for spray, 30 minutes for rotors, and an hour for drip. Those were my numbers that I learned. And they were just based off of someone's experience. Well, this is we're seeing exactly what's going on in a particular soil type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for quickly as that's drying down, I would suspect that that is a pretty coarse soil, so it doesn't have much water holding capacity. Or with those leveling out down around 27%, it also could be that they are overwatering that bed also, because it's leveling off right around 27% for an extended period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, a lot to interpret from the moisture graphs.
Yep. Here's another a good example of, we see a increase in watering a couple places, notably here and here, but we don't see any run times. And so I'm going to make an assumption that it was about to water because it got very close to the threshold, and then we had a rain event. So we could have even been hours away. And again, oftentimes this happens where just before it hits that lower threshold, we get a rain event and we get free water to fill the tank back up. And if you look at the date range, again, this is half of June and half of July, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waterings. So peak ET and only watered 5 times. Thanks to Mother Nature.
Yeah, beautiful.
Got about 5 minutes left here. So let's talk about this. This is a frequently asked question, can we use moisture sensors and a weather station?
With a baseline system, Base Manager, yes, you can.
Mm-hmm. And this comes up quite a bit as well. I know I've got methodology that I use with customers, and I think you've got some different tactics that you use too, Chris. I'll start by talking about using a moisture sensor as the kind of kill switch, the off, the wet condition. So if you think about setting up your program to use ET in the weather station, you can add a moisture sensor as what we would call a program stop, so that if the moisture were to reach field capacity, which is measurable, and the ET calculations are still calling for more water, the moisture sensor can basically terminate that program, can turn it off when it reaches wet. But I know that's not the only way, and sometimes you often use sensors as that dry indicator as well.
Yeah, it can prevent overwatering. Every day there's going to be ET that's measured. So a system that's operating on weather-based protocol is going to want to apply water. So using a moisture sensor in a lower threshold scenario could help facilitate that deep and infrequent watering, even using a weather station by controlling the interval. And then applying a larger amount or a higher application of water after elongated duration, so that you get a deep and infrequent type of watering scenario, so it encourages better root growth. So using the two technologies together can optimize not only water conservation, but can also optimize plant health and aesthetic value as well.
Yeah. And one thing I'll point out, so on a base station 3200, that's where we have the primary and linked arrangement. On a base station 1000, the sensor controls the entire program. But on that 3200, you can actually choose by zone. You could have zone 1 use ET in the weather station, and zones 2, 3, and 4 use a sensor. So even within a program, you can have some zones using ET and some zones using moisture sensors.
Tremendous.
Or a combination of both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. All right. What kind of questions do we have coming in, Chris?
There were a couple of questions regarding the graphs. One, why there was irrigation that happened like on the 4th of July without reaching the lower level on the last slide.
That's actually good. Let me mention that green lower threshold line. When you run the report, it locates that line where it is currently set at the time the report is run, and so it can be tricky to look back historically, because the threshold could have been set differently at that time. And we can only put one bar on the screen. And you can imagine if the threshold was changed 16 times over the course of a month, the graph would just be full of thresholds. And so
are you saying that you change the threshold that frequently?
saying, yeah, we are good at what we do and we micromanage.
Also on those month-long graphs, the resolution of the lines is not really finite, so it may appear that it reached or didn't reach that threshold line. But if you zoom in on it and see the threshold, even if it's off 0.1% above or below that line, it could impact whether or not it watered. So zeroing in on your resolution or zooming in on your resolution can give you some bit more clarity as to the behavior of the system. All right, very good. We are at our time limit, gentlemen. So another successful episode of Tech Talk Tuesday. We appreciate everybody's participation. Look forward to next week. What's on tap for next week, Andy?
Well, I think next week we're going to be talking about networking. So we're going to be going over things like Ethernet connections, Wi-Fi connections, IP addresses. We might speak a little bit to BACnet and how that gets set up on a server, but we're going to talk about networking and communication.
Cool.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks for everybody's
involvement.
We appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Stay healthy.
Great to see you.
Let's get some work done.
Okay. Take care.
All right.
Bye.